Hello, my name is Leo and welcome to a new tutorial by Blauw Films. Today we will be continuing our Syntactic Labyrinths series and we will be looking at how I created Mercury. Now Mercury is a pretty complicated planet to look at. We do have a lot of NASA images from Mercury, but none of them are actually true photographic reference. They are something you would call false color photographs or narrowband photographs, and other of them are monochrome mosaics of a bunch of smaller sampled images. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is kind of how bright Mercury would be to our eyes, or how bright Mercury would be to the Hubble Space Telescope. I've got this NASA book over here, and let me just read you a little excerpt from it. There are no Hubble images of Mercury because the planet is too close to the Sun. Light from the Sun would destroy the telescope's sensitive optics and electronics. Now, if we go to Cinema 4D, assuming this is kind of what Mercury would look like if we were to have a photograph from the Hubble Space Telescope. If there's anyone who is associated with NASA, please let me know. Please confirm if this is anything that's getting anywhere near accuracy. But similarly to how when we look at our moon, it tends to look overexposed until we give our eyes a little time to adjust. Mercury being so close to the Sun basically makes it a massive bright light ball. In this example over here, I'm using a camera with a shutter speed of 1/50 and an ISO of 800 and a f-stop of 24. Now, the thing is, in all the previous tutorials we did, which you can check out on the channel, we had some pretty accurate data on what the camera settings were on each of the cameras used to photograph the planets. Now, when it comes to Mercury, because it was photographed by the dual camera system on the Messenger probe, we don't actually have any camera information, or nothing really that we can work with inside of a CG software. The dual camera system on Messenger had two cameras, one that would be taking a 1024 by 1024 low resolution sample picture of different sections of the planet. These would be monochrome, so you would have a black and white output that would then be compiled into a grid in post that would cover the entire surface, and that way you would have your surface map of the planet. This could then either be used to recomp a 3D model or to just use as reference for separate sections. Now, the other camera on the Messenger probe is a bit more what we are looking at. Now, it uses what you call narrowband filtering. And this is a whole nother topic that is super interesting. And basically, if you have your generic DSLR, you are working with full range or what you would call true color imagery. And you have the entire spectrum of visible light. When you are working with narrowband imaging, they use what you call a narrowband filter, which filters out a very specific 6 nanometer range of your wavelength. So you could focus in on the oxygen wavelength or on the sulfur wavelength, and you would be able to get just those colors coming into your sensor. Cool, let's get right into it. So first things first, we're in Photoshop. I have this map over here, which is just a very simple monochrome Mercury 8K map. From what I just told you, we know that these aren't the colors of Mercury. What you could do is you could go into here and manually hand paint some variations into the colors. Or what we could try to do is, if I come into After Effects, if I drag this Mercury right into here, I'm going to create a duplicate and I'm going to go to Effect, Color Correction, Colorama. Now what this will do is it will basically cycle the white to black values into a spectrum of colors. So as most of the colors we have are in the mid-range, we aren't really getting too many cool variations of colors. We'll be moving the points around a little bit until we have something a bit more fitting the vibe that we're looking for. When I talk about the vibe that we're looking for, I'm basically just talking about the overall positioning of the colors. We will be changing the colors in a second. I'm opening PureRef right now just to have a reference board on the side. If you type in Mercury True Color Image on Google, there isn't too much you can find. There is this main image that's popping up about everywhere when you type this in, and it gives a very interesting variation. Now, we do know that even this isn't a actual true color image and has been photographed with several narrowband filters. I'm just going to drag and drop this in because it means that we do have at least some truth to some of these values. What I will do now is I'll just have a look. So we have the pink value over here. I'm going to select the pink value and I'm going to color pick this whitish yellow over here. Now the next thing we have is this blue value right around there. So I'm going to double click this thing and we are going to select something close to there. So let's see, we have the yellowish there. So I'm going to go for one of these bluish gray tones. Nice. Now, what I will do is I will change the blending mode to color over here. And now I'm just going to be slightly decreasing the opacity until we have something somewhat interesting. I'm going to add Mercury to the top and I'm going to do a very quick color correction, just increasing as much of the exposure as possible. There we go, just keeping some of these darker details. And then I am going to be color burning those. Now, the reason I'm color burning them is because I'm at 32 bits per channel. If you were to do something like multiply, you'll see that at 32 bits, we are also increasing the light value. So by using color burn and then just basically lowering the opacity a bit, we can pretty much control the contrast ratio that we want to have on that Mars map. I feel like I'm quickly going to be increasing the saturation to some of these. Now, if we go to full resolution, you'll see that what we're doing is not that completely off, right? What we can do is still play a little bit around with the color nodes. As you can see, I just added a few more in the color wheel, and we can just tweak it a little bit, make this blue a little bit cooler. There you go. I feel like that's about right. We're definitely having less blue in the planet here, but I'm trying to get a value that's somewhere in between the false color colored image and the monochromatic image that we have from Mercury. So I'm just gonna save this frame. I'm just gonna say, let's call it a TIFF and just the RGB and just call it diffuse. And we're gonna hit render. Now let's have a look at Cinema 4D. Inside of Cinema 4D, I have created two spheres, which are copies of each other with just a slight radius change. The bottom one is the planet itself, which we will just call Mercury. And that has a radius of 2,440 centimeters. Basically, the way that I go about this is I just go to each planet and I type in name of the planet and then size. And then whatever the radius is in kilometers, that's what I have been using in centimeters. The reason why I do this is that I like to keep the size of my scenes relatively small, and due to still maintaining the ratio correct, when I start playing with multiple planets together in the same scene, they are all correctly sized relative to each other. Now, Mercury doesn't actually have an atmosphere, but it does have what they call a exosphere. I have given it a radius of about 5 kilometers, which seems to be correct from what I found online. When it comes to the materials, we have a physical material over here in Corona Renderer. Whatever render engine you're using, these settings are pretty much the same. We have the 8K Mars texture here, which right now we're going to be replacing for our diffuse texture. And we have a roughness map, which I've created in Photoshop. It's basically, I took the background, I generated a bump map here by selecting the layer, going to Filter 3D, Generate Bump Map, and the result you get from it is something that's pretty easily converted into something like a glossiness map or a roughness map. With the default settings, you get something like this. And what I like to do then for the glossiness is to just add a 60%, say 40% gray, depending on how you read it, on top of it, and then just lower that down to about 30-40% of intensity. This is just the way I generate a glossiness map for a planet, as you can see here. That will then be flipped inside of Corona Render by just flipping the black point and the white point to make sure that we have a roughness map. Then we have a normal map, which you can generate through Photoshop as well, just up here in 3D, generate normal map. And you can play around with the settings a little bit. I think I didn't do too much. I might have just moved the left slider a little bit in. And then finally, we have a displacement map, which is my bump map that I generated, which then I added a bit of an exposure control to get a bigger contrast between some of the peaks and some of the lows. When it comes to the displacement, I just typed in what's the tallest point on Mercury, and I found that it was at 4.4 kilometers, 4.5 kilometers, and the lowest point on Mercury was a visible crater at negative 5.3 kilometers. So there we go. Now that's about it for the texturing. As you can see here, you have the colored version of Mercury we've just added. We can also just use the black and white version of the map if you prefer. We're using a focal length of 1200 and we have a white balance of 5600 on the camera. The lens is super long. It's really super long, 1200 millimeters. But think of it as this camera being on a space probe, and we're very far away from our subject. That way, you know, these super long lenses, they compress the space so much, and that's kind of that look that you're familiar to seeing when it comes to space and astrophotography. Inside of the Corona tag, we have our more standard camera settings. I have a ISO set to 800 and the shutter speed set to 1/1000. Now, when I did the Mars tutorial, I actually spoke about how the shutter speed on these things usually is a bit faster than 1/1000 second, but unfortunately Corona Renderer doesn't go any faster than this. So we had to compensate by just lowering the intensity of the sun. It's at 10 right now, which is more than usual. When it comes to these planets, I tend to have a pretty high intensity, somewhere around the 20 or 25. To finish off the camera settings, we have a f-stop of 24, trying to get as much of the planet in focus as possible. I have a highlight compression of 1.2, and I got bloom and glare and sharpening and depth of field all enabled with relatively default settings. Now if we move to our sunlight, if you're trying to light this planet in a more creative, non-realistic way, be sure to use your softbox area lights. Be sure to pull out whatever you want, add your neon tubes. You would be able to get some very decent, very cool looking results. Me, I was trying to get this familiar kind of look. Using a sun with a temperature of 6000 makes it this strong white light, so non-filtered, no atmosphere, just raw sunlight in space. And I have the size set to 1 to make sure that we have a very sharp shadow. I'm actually going to be moving the sun a little bit so we can see how harsh the shadow is. Especially in these recent years, when I look at a lot of space movies, there is a tendency to use a softer light source, a larger light source, to get a more cinematic fall off on these planets. So you would have something like a sun of 32, and as you can see, it creates this very cinematic looking fall off on the shadow, and this looks very epic, but in a way it makes the planet feel smaller. If you're trying to create that natural look, be sure to keep your sun setting as harsh as possible. Except for that, just play around with the position of your light. I'm quickly going to go into the exosphere material. Generally speaking, there's not much you have to do there, as the exosphere of Mercury doesn't really have a color or anything like that. But I did use a volume material with a absorption color of somewhere around the yellow range. As you can see there, the RGB values. And then I'm using a scattering that's using a Fresnel that's starting with a black and ending with a black, meaning that it's basically transparent in the center where the camera is looking at, and it will be transparent right at the edges of the planet. And the colors I've used in the middle are basically just gray values with a little bit of color variation in these colors that we're familiar to seeing here. So we have this little bit of a yellowish brown here and a little bit of a greenish cyan tone that transitions into this bluey tone, kind of giving you that mid-range of the spectrum. Now the directionality is set to 0.34. This is the value that works for me. And the distance, I got that at 1200. Usually my rule of thumb for the absorption distance is either half or a third of the radius of your planet. And that way you get a pretty natural looking atmosphere. So that's about it when it comes to what I did inside of Cinema 4D. Now, there's one more thing I would like to look at, and that's some basic comping techniques inside of After Effects. I'm going to be rendering out a still from this, and then we'll talk to you in a second. Alright, now to finish this off, there's just a quick technique I would like to show you in After Effects, and then I guess it's time for me to go to bed. So we have our Mercury imported over here. One of the things you tend to see in these NASA images is a little bit of a blur fall off right at the edges of these planets. So the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to duplicate that layer. I'm going to go to Effect, Generate, Fill. And I'm going to fill it with pure white. Now I'm going to duplicate that layer a second time and I'm going to fill it with pure black. Now, if you put just a solid black layer behind it, we can essentially use blurs to control a Luma matte. So if we take the white fill layer and we apply a Gaussian blur, if you look at this, if I increase that blur, we are expanding that edge. Let's say we give it a blur of 100. You get this kind of effect. What we can do is we can take the black fill layer and add a Gaussian blur on that to expand the edge inwards. So we have something like this, some kind of a halo. Now, if we take these three layers and then pre-compose them, we have now created a Luma mask that we can use to drive any of our blur effects. So I can create a new adjustment layer with a camera lens blur, and then I'm changing the aspect ratio to 0.5 because I did use that in Corona Renderer as well. And down here at Track Matte, if I go to Luma Matte, you can't really see it too well right now because our Luma Matte is not strong enough. But if I lock this composition over here, and then I open up this one and drag it to the side, I can add a adjustment layer in here. I can just use a exposure effect to now control the amount of blur that we have. So if I drastically increase that, you'll be able to start seeing a bit more of a blur over there. If I start bumping this up like crazy, here you go, now you can really tell. So you don't want to go too crazy because now you'll start getting a sharp edge. So what we would like to do is stay somewhere in the 2 to 3 range. And then we can play with the blurriness of the black layer inside to then create a softer fall off. Now it's very good to have some photographic reference next to you while you're doing this. I'd say that one thing we have to do is we have to give it a little bit more of a softer fall off. So I'm going to double the Gaussian blur to about 200. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lower the Gaussian blur on the white layer. That should also give us a little bit of a cleaner result over there. And now I'm gonna just decrease the exposure a little bit more. Cool, this is looking pretty alright. Oh, this is really about tweaking, right? Trying to get the settings as best as you can. Cool, I'm pretty happy with that. Now finally, to finish this off, I'm gonna apply some stars to the background. Now you can get your star plates anywhere you like. If you want to use the same ones that we use at Blauw Films, you can just follow the link in the description below. Come to the ArtStation store over here, and then we have a 100 organic star fields pack. Here you go, $5.99, and you will never have to worry about any of your stars. 100 EXR maps that have been taken from real stars from NASA. Alright, the stars are looking okay, but they are a little bit too bright for the down exposed shot that we have over here. Now what you can do to make sure that you have your star maps correctly exposed is just go here into Cinema 4D and grab a plane. Just give it a standard resolution, something like 1920 by 1080. I'm gonna scale it back up. What you can do is just create a light material and apply one of your star maps. Now, even though we are working with basically arbitrary values when it comes to these light numbers, we are able to create some consistency, especially if you're going from one shot to the other. So as you can see here in our render, we're not actually able to see any of the stars. Now, because we have a shutter speed of 1/1000, that's just too fast to be able to capture any of those relatively weak light sources. That means that any star we add into this plate will be purely based on a creative preference. So what I will do is I'm deleting 2 of these star plates, so we just work with 1, and I'm going to be excluding almost all of these stars. And I'm just going to be adding 1 or 2 of them to give it that little bit of depth in the image. The way that I want to do that is I'm just going to create a new solid, noise and grain, fractal noise, and then let me just solo that layer for a second. And I'm going to change basic to dynamic, and then I'm going to contrast the crap out of it. And now I'm going to lower the brightness. There you go. Now finally, I'm going to increase the scale, and that should be about it. Now I'm just going to take the organic plate and I'm going to Luma Matte that fractal noise. There you go. We have basically excluded all the stars except for 1 or 2 here and there. I'm going to apply 1 more extra star. I'm going to take this nice one over here. Ooh, that's a wonky mask. And I'm just going to move that layer to be somewhere up here. It's looking alright. I don't actually like that star over there, so I will just simply be cutting that one out. Here you go. I'm trying to keep the composition as central as possible. When it comes to post-processing these images, there's not too much I'd like to do. I'm just pre-composing everything, and then after that I'm adding a new adjustment layer with a color correction tritone effect. And here I am just emulating a little bit of a film color processing. So the highlights, I'm giving them a little bit of a yellow tint. The midtones, I'm going for this murky green color. And for the shadows, I'm going to be going for a very deep dark purple. As you can see, we do need to add 1 black solid all the way to the back. Cool. So now I'm just going to be blending that with the original for about 95-94%. Here you go. It's just a very, very subtle effect. Except for that, I'm going to be adding a little bit of film grain on top, just to break up some of the blurred edges we have and just to break up some of the background. So we could be using film grain, but one of the things that I like to use is some digital noise as well. So we have these digital noise assets from the A7S Mark II and from the Canon 60D, and we're working on some other ones. But right now, let's say we take this ISO 32000 from the A7S, and we're just gonna drag and drop it right on top. And as you can see, it gives a very different effect than your film grain kind of effect. So I'm gonna set that to soft light, and if I toggle that on and off, you can see that we are losing some intensity. So I'm gonna keep it on, and I'm going to use a curves adjustment. I'm gonna be moving the slider up on this side. There we go. Now, one of the things you could do as well, even though that's not really what I like to do, is you can add an adjustment layer over here with a Gaussian blur effect, and then you could blur that out and set this to screen. And that way you can create some kind of a more glowy effect. Now that looks horrendous, but if you lower that down to, let's say 5 to 10%, you'll see you get a little bit of a glowy effect. Quite soothing and quite interesting to look at. but right now I'm going for the sharp photography kind of look. Cool, and that's it. That concludes the How to Make Mercury tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm very excited to see all of you sticking to the channel. We have a new lighting mastery tutorial coming up with Eric. We have a transcoding and proxies tutorial coming up with Gabby. And I'll be doing some visual effects stuff. So, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to like this video. And yeah, talk to you soon. Have a great night. Cheers. Bye-bye.